Hey, welcome back to the Resolute Man podcast. I've got my friend Josh Branham here. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good. We met a few weeks ago, and really cool to see what God's doing through Hill City Church. You're a lead pastor there, but also although that's a great thing, you're more than that. You're a writer, and you're really passionate about the youth. And I've got a lot of youth. I've got 9 kids, so I care about the youth, and I think we all care about the youth because that's the next generation. So I'm excited about our discussions today, but really, really great to have you on the show. And you got a new book coming out too at some point, right?
Yeah, at some point. It's in process right now. I have a finished manuscript, but essentially it's written to that next generation, trying to be a voice to help that new emerging kingdom leaders, to rise up and to take their place in leading in God's kingdom. So that's really the heart and the passion that I have. I am a lead pastor. I did, some time in youth ministry like many lead pastors do, but I still have that kind of sweet spot. I speak at youth conferences. I try to still find ways to pour into the next generation.
Well, it's an important topic for this podcast because most of the guys listening have children, and there's really no more important job other than being a husband is being a good father. And so this is really good. I think we can get some good perspectives from you too, and just kind of what's happening with the youth, and maybe even more important than that, empowering youth to make a difference. And I know you're passionate about that, and I know the Bible speaks about that, and it's important because it really feels like in our society there's a lot of delayed progress in children. I mean,
certainly.
Back in the old days, there was 14, 15, 16-year-olds captaining ships. There were children, doing incredible things. Now, there are some of those things happening today, but for the most part, we've delayed the progress of children through the education system. And so now when they're 18, now a lot of times they're going to school for 4 more years. Now they're 22. But I think it's good to recognize that, wow, children are so capable, but it's important they feel capable. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, basically by all the normal metrics of like becoming an adult in our Western society have just continued to be more and more delayed in recent generations. And so beyond that, though, it's really the idea of, does the next generation have a perception of itself that they can do big things? Or do they kind of have that, there's that like hashtag adulting, maybe you've kind of seen that. And it's, there's all these kind of jokes about like, well, no one taught me how to change, take out the lint from the dryer, and that's been building up, hashtag adulting, right? There's all those kind of like those funny things you can look at that. But the reality is there's a very serious sense in which, like, are we equipping, are we empowering, are we, even trusting the next generation to lead and do significant things, like in days gone by where they were trusted like with people's lives, Yeah. And now it's like, well, I'm 28 years old and I still don't even know how to, get the oil changed in my car, or like fill in the blank, whatever those like hashtag adulting things are. And I would say it's up to us to actually be the ones who hand the keys over by how we treat the expectations we have of the next generation, but also the ways that we give them opportunities, train them up. This is how we parent our own children, as well as taking risks at times on investing into the next generation, the workplace and ministry, and all those different arenas.
So true. I just was traveling, and we drove by our old place, and we as a family together planted a vineyard. And this is when our oldest now were very small. And it was an extraordinary experience. And it got me thinking back to my oldest son was driving the small tractor between the vineyard rows at age 8 and mowing, and never once hit one of those plants. You hit one of those plants, I mean, those plants can grow for 100 years if you don't ruin them, right? And you never hit one of those things, and you had to get it just right. So it's, I've always seen in my own parenting that children rise to the level of responsibility that you give them. And a lot of times as parents, we don't realize the progress they're making and how much they can actually handle at younger ages, and then the busyness of life, and sometimes the normal rhythms that we put our children into aren't causing the level of aggressive growth that could be happening within them. And then at the core of human beings, I think God put this in us, is we need to feel needed, we need to feel responsible, and we need to know that because we're here, we are making a difference. It can be in a very small way, but if children feel and young adults feel like, wow, I'm making a difference, something is happening good in this world because of the things I'm doing in my presence, that builds a confidence in a need, because we all need to feel needed, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, for a lot of parents, there's typically, there's no ill intention, right? There's usually like, well, the intention that I have is I want to give my kids, this kind of almost like Pinterest-worthy childhood, right? Or this social media-worthy childhood where I want them to have all the experiences that I never had. I want them to, have all the possessions that we weren't able to afford. And, that maybe comes from a genuine place of love and care and compassion for your kids. But the reality is God designed us to rule and to reign and to work. And one of the most loving things we can do is also prepare the next generation by giving them opportunities. Maybe they start small and maybe they grow bigger from there. But I believe it starts at a very young age. All three, like we have like a motorized lawnmower, but we also have one of those, the real mowers, right? Yeah. All three of my young daughters have helped me with mowing the lawn, and our youngest is 2 years old. Yeah. And so it's like, for a lot of people, it's like, hey, don't let your 2-year-old like get her fingers anywhere close to those blades, as they're spinning around. But I think it really has to do with, man, one of the most loving things we can do is help the next generation, help our own children begin to find their spiritual gifts through serving, through giving them responsibilities, because it's really difficult to identify how someone's gifted, how someone can be used in God's kingdom if they're never given a shot.
Yes, they need to feel that. And failure is a good lesson anyways. There is no real failure, right? You're learning through mistakes and things like that. You're giving them perspective. But if they're not giving opportunity to rise up and even stumbling with that, you're not now having that opportunity to come in and coach them and be there to guide them and have perspective on that and develop that rhino skin that I think children is essential for children in these more unprecedented times. Hey, guys listening, they're going to be launching into a completely different world than we have today. I don't know all the ins and outs of it. I can see the trends. You can see the trends. We should pay attention to that. Are we actually digging in and making them stronger, by handling adversity? Well, if they don't know how to handle adversity, they're going to have a hard time out there. Most importantly is their faith and godliness. We can't save our kids, of course, but we can do a lot. And fathers have such a huge, huge role. Being a pastor of such a large church, and I know there's a big presence of youth there, which is beautiful. What is some of your perspectives on what you see happening in regards to opportunities for fathers?
Yeah, I think, spiritual leadership in the home is, such an important role. And, for many, many students, what we've seen both, in youth ministry years ago and even today with the youth, the young adults at our church, many of them just don't have that presence. So there's tons of opportunities for mentors to come in, to be disciple makers, to be what Paul was for Timothy, to be the spiritual father when Timothy didn't have, his actual father discipling him and pouring into him. But I would say for men listening, like if you have children, especially in the home, those have got to be your primary disciples that you make. That's the challenge. I give that call to our church all the time. Is that we have an awesome kids ministry. We have tons of young families. We've got great volunteers, but just every parent who walks through our doors or is part of our church, they know like you are the primary disciple maker of your children. And there's a lot of challenges that come with that, right? But it's there's decisions that you've got to make. But I think really the greatest challenge is, are you going to devote that time to spending discipling your own children? I think there's a huge conflict that, and I would say the next generation feels this as well. We talk about like, hey, find your gifts, explore your spiritual gifts, serve God's kingdom, make a difference of your life. The truth is, there's a little bit of a paradox of this is also one of the most stressed out, kind of overstimulated, busy generations of school-age children, because there's all this homework, there's all these extracurricular activities, and so there's kind of this, well, you're so busy, so just here's your phone, here's more screen time, here's more activities. The reality is we're doing a little bit of a disservice. But I think parents experience that as well, where there's this, I want to work, I want to provide, and so you almost use your best energy in that arena of taking care of the household, providing the finances, that sort of stuff, that you don't have the energy to spend in those rhythms of discipleship.
Sometimes I think, too, we get discouraged inside. It's almost insecurities develop because, hey, they're listening to people way more capable than me. They're busy with all these activities. Look, they got a coach over here, and I'm busy, and I'm just trying to keep everything together. And so I definitely understand that. But I think that the truth that men need to be reminded, just maybe a gentle reminder, is that there is no influence other than your wife that is as powerful as yours. And you could say the same thing as someone else, and it just means more. Even if, when you do it, it doesn't seem like it registered with your child. I just want to encourage you that regardless of the response back from your children when you're trying to coach them, encourage them, help them on their path and so forth, give them wisdom, teach them the Bible, even if that response isn't what you wanted, I just encourage you to stay the course, because a father that consistently applies himself and rids himself of the noise, oh, they're getting taken care of over here, oh, they're busy with their football or whatever the thing is. I think the enemy, that noise sometimes is the enemy discouraging you, because I think the enemy knows if I can take out the fathers and make them passive and make them feel like everything's going well, checked off the list, I went to church, they're in the programs, they were doing this, those are great things. But if that's causing you to not be present in a more intentional way, there's a problem. And you cannot, I encourage everybody listening, you cannot just look to everybody around you for how well you think you're doing as a father. Because these are different times. Your children need to be discipled in the ways of God. They need to be equipped in those things. So I appreciate what you're saying. 1 Timothy, I think we both love this verse. 1 Timothy 4:12 says, Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. And you're right, he was mainly raised in a spiritual sense by his grandma and his mom, Timothy. And then look at what happened to Timothy. He was exhorted to spread the church and put leadership in the churches. Incredible, right?
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think we're seeing some of that today, and I think we're going to see more of that in the future of the church, that there's a lot of talk about how many kind of Gen Z, Gen Alpha are kind of leaving, walking away from the church, walking away from youth group, walking away from their faith. And I'm here to tell you, like, it takes sometimes a white-hot, fiery remnant that's setting an example to reach their own generation and to even reach their parents, right? To set an example to older believers and reinvigorate their faith. We've seen that. Our church story is a story filled with lots of twists and turns, but one of those chapters involved a merger with an older congregation. And there has been a fresh wind of spiritual movement for that generation, just rubbing shoulders and being in prayer groups and serving alongside some of the younger generation. And so, I would just encourage, fathers as well, that investment you make, you're making an investment not just to have the vision of, I hope that my kid goes to church until the day they die. You're making an investment on kingdom leaders who could, do more for God's kingdom than you ever do yourself. And I just that's a vision that I want to call every man to, right? And just to have that, pray big, train big, encourage, speak those things. But I recognize the tension, right? The tension that every man feels in that.
That age integration you're talking about is so essential. I'm so encouraged to hear you're doing that. And if any other pastors are hearing this, I think we need to look for ways to get the older people discussing things with the younger people and doing things with them. I know in my children's lives, that's been essential. Other older men, looking them in the eyes and having real conversations with them, not overlooking the youth. When social things happen, hospitality happens, we're out, a sporting event, things like that. Not just talking to the adults, but going to each other's children and talking to them and building relationships with them, because it is unbelievably powerful. And when you have friends around you that you trust to speak into your children's lives, that can be amazing. I'm glad to hear that culture is being encouraged in your church. Good job.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I'm curious for you.
Yeah.
With so many different kids and different ages of kids, right? Most in the home, but some out of the home. How do you navigate the tension of? I remember. So we have three daughters.
Yeah.
And I remember that was like the big thing when we went from 2 to 3. Most of our friend group had 2 kids, and they were like, "How can you be outnumbered?" And like you're at the next level of that, right?
Yeah.
So how do you navigate that, like, okay, I want to not just have this, I'm going to disciple my family in general, but even just that idea of like paying attention to each specific child's needs and growth and all that sort of stuff. Like, how do you and your wife navigate that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And originally, I set out to have 2 kids. I kind of wanted that perfect family of success. This is when I was young. 2 kids, the dog, and perfect marriage, right?
Yeah.
And God had much better plans for me, and He has a unique plan for every family. I'm not one that believes anybody should have a family that looks exactly like mine or something like that. But I think that one of the things that was interesting is your capacity grows one child at a time. Mm-hmm. And your love actually grows. There isn't like this finite amount of love. Sometimes think, okay, I've got my children and I want to be able to pour just as much love into these children as possible. Well, what happens when you have more children is your love just expands. Mm-hmm. It's not a finite resource. And so I've experienced that my love just expands. And I look around and I go, I can't imagine. Yes, it's been hard. Yes, my wife's been pregnant most of her 24 years of marriage. We have 9 children. I'm in every parenting season, which is kind of odd and cool. I have 2 grandchildren, and I have a 2-year-old, and I have a 23-year-old. So it's just a wild ride. But, I when I was younger, I realized, I had this turning point. I realized, I was really big into impacting the world and helping people. And I realized that the most important way I could help the world and impact the world was through my family. And even though it's smaller, I got this message, smaller is bigger. And that's not true in every single situation, but for that, it was really true. And then in addition to that, I just want to encourage people, if you do have this, sometimes people are on the fence of whether we have more children or not. If you're on that fence, I want you to realize that there's this curve. There's this difficulty curve. And when you have 2 children, first of all, 0 to 1 is the biggest change, right? Then you go to 2 children, well, okay, and you can have that thought, okay, there's 1-on-1, we each have one, right? And then you go to 3, you're outnumbered. I understand that thinking. Well, actually, when the first one gets 7, 6, 7, 8, they become an asset. They become a helper. They can do so many things. They can start prep cooking in the kitchen. They can start doing all kinds of things. When they get to 8, 9, 10, they can help out around the property. They can do all kinds of things. When they're in the 10, 11, 12, if you're training them correctly, they are an incredible help, and it's also helping them mature faster by being a help.
Yeah.
And so you're not actually alone. In fact, we just did a trip. We drove in one car together. We rented a house Airbnb. We went to restaurants. We sit down, we take over a whole section of a restaurant. We're not doing it alone. We're working, we're parenting for sure, but we have older children that deeply love their younger siblings and love helping. And I think setting that culture, just like you would set a culture in a church, because I have that background in me of organizational culture in the corporate world, business world, is if you apply that to your family, everybody listening, it's amazing. And I think that's what happens. So many of our skills stop before we enter the front door of our house. And I think one of the things I've learned is I was a voracious learner of leadership and business. And I just decided to go, you know what? That's going to work perfectly when I go home. So I have the Bible and I have my business experience. That's perfect. And the Holy Spirit prompting me and how to use those things in the right way. And then I have my teammate, my wife, and making sure our marriage is aligned. And, when you have more kids, the capacity, it grows. But also your marriage grows if you do it right, because now you're having a lot more conversations about all kinds of things. So anyways, that was a good question.
Yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about though, right? What your family story kind of forced you guys to, empower the older kids as they're taking care of younger kids, or, helping with chores, doing that sort of stuff. I would just encourage people who aren't necessarily forced into that to still do that, because that is going to be one of the greatest things. I in my upbringing, there was a season where my parents were separated, and my brother had a driver's license and I didn't. I was 12, 13 years old, and I had a sister who was 10 years younger than me. And so I kind of I was like the childcare. I was the solution for that season. And I look back on that, and I kind of resented that a little bit at the time. Like, I wish I had a driver's license and a truck, or whatever. But the truth is, that's one of the things that's actually served me the best now as a leader of both my family and this church, and the opportunities God has given me. And so those are just great opportunities and experiences because the truth is, you can't have 9 kids and give each of them all the extracurricular activities and all the, you can't the typical American, my job as a parent is to give my kids, all this happiness and experiences and fun. You can't actually function like that, right? That's not reproducible, but training and discipleship and, that's actually that's a reproducible system there. So
it is. Hey, I have another question that's popped in my head for you, Josh, is that, you're leading this church. There's lots of men there that have families, and a lot of times for guys, and I can even remember being like this in some ways, because I became a believer at 23. I was married 8 months later to a super strong Christian wife. And I understood early that I had to lead my family. That was what God wanted me to do spiritually. And so I had some catch-up work to do. She was gracious. Obviously, it took time. But I got a mentor, and that stayed with me for 12 years. And I started realizing that in the beginning of going to church, when I was 23, I would look to the pastor and I would go, wow, they really know their Bible. Wow, they really know how to orate their Bible. That's incredible. And there was this gap of my capabilities and where I saw their capabilities. And I think it's important. I guess the question is, how are you closing that gap? Because they don't have the same responsibility as you to lead a big church, but they do have a responsibility to break the Bible open and teach their family. And while it never has to be a full sermon or anything like that, but what do you do to help people in your church close that gap so they're not feeling like you're over here on a pedestal and the Bible's distant from me, but I too can wield the sword of the Spirit well?
Yeah, for sure. I think, man, there's a lot to that. I think the first thing that I try to do is to clarify, right, that the best sermon that I'll ever preach is the conversations I have with my own kids, or the people, the young guys that I disciple, right? Mm-hmm. And I as best as I can model that, not just do my job as a preacher, and to help people understand, you don't have to prepare a 35-minute sermon to evangelize, to share the gospel with someone. You don't have to prepare a sermon to spend a little bit of time reading a Jesus storybook Bible and praying with your kids. You don't, those are the things you don't preaching a sermon is what I do because I'm a pastor and I preach, right? But I also have to do all the other stuff just as a godly man who, is a husband and a father and a good friend to someone who's maybe lost, right? And so I've got to live that out myself, and I think that's maybe part of the problem is where pastors maybe have that, I do my spiritual stuff on Sundays, so I don't really have to do it as much at home. And I think that's like its own conversation, right?
Yeah.
And you look at kind of the stereotypes about pastors' kids and why aren't they strong in their faith? I think part of it is where the church uses up some of the best discipleship energy from its church leaders instead of kind of the other way around, right, where they're leading that at home. But the truth is, the reality is, man, I would just encourage anyone who's felt that gap, just like to hear it from a pastor, no one remembers what I say from a sermon. Like in the moment, people are like, "That was great. That was but the truth is, I've been doing this for a while now, and no one remembers that main point I put on the screen. No one remembers like the visual aids, all the things I work really hard on doing, and so the form isn't the important part. It's the function. It's, did you open God's word, and that's where the power is. Do you know the gospel, and you can articulate the gospel? That's the power of God for salvation for all who believe. And so, like, even simple things like memorizing scripture is probably more powerful for somebody to be able to do, that's going to equip that person to share with their family, with their friends, than the ability to, like, the homiletics, the hermeneutics, all the like things that I learned in seminary, all those sorts of things. Just the ability to like be someone who meditates on the law of the Lord day and night, memorize scripture, be in the word yourself, right? Have a reading plan, all that sort of stuff. The way that I do it at home is I do Jesus stories for my daughters. And sometimes it looks like reading kind of the storybooks. But honestly, I just try to, if I had read a story that I think I could explain to a 6-year-old, I'll just, as they go to bed, I'll just explain it. I'll just say, hey, here's a Jesus story, and I'll just talk to them about it. And man, the kinds of questions that like 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds ask about theology, it's just like, oh my goodness, Oh yeah. Like they're asking me about the nature of man and sin. Like they don't know that's what they're asking, but they're like, so why does God create bad guys? And I was like, well, that's puzzled, like it's just like, does he, or and but just it's actually in those simple ways. That's really what it looks like, and it has a lot more to do with intentionality and rhythms, right? So what are the rhythms that you're putting in place with prayer? Like when are you praying? When do you have scheduled time to pray, either as a couple or as a family? Is it just at the dinner table? Like, do you have times where you're doing that? When are you getting in the Word? And then beyond that, we do Sabbath. I try to disconnect from my phone and on Saturdays and spend that intentional time with rest. So it's all of those rhythms, and I would just encourage people to take whatever that next step is, and to build from there. The hard thing is when you feel like maybe how you felt early in your marriage, where it was like, oh, I've got to get here, and it's like you don't have to get there today.
No.
I'm curious, like, hey, getting a mentor, that sort of stuff. What were some of those initial steps that you took, though, to kind of become that spiritual leader in your marriage?
I mean, getting a mentor was great. Reading the Word was important. I think that what was also important is my wife understanding. She has a lot of words. A lot of wives have a lot of words to say. And I think that she started to understand that it's important to create space for me to lead also. And I think it's a dance between a husband and wife, and I think both husband and wives need to be into it. They need to, the wife needs to want their husband to lead spiritually, and I'm just so thankful that she wanted that, so she created some space to do that. Also, I literally asked this gentleman to mentor me. He was an older guy. His kids were already grown, and knew his Bible wise. He was teaching Bible studies at the church, big mega church I was going to. And so a lot of people wanted his time. A lot of people talked to him. He seemed to know everybody. And so the first thought was, well, he's not gonna spend time for me. He's a busy guy. But then I felt like the Spirit was prompting me to ask him, and I asked him, and he said, you know what? I've been praying that you would ask me. But I was never going to tell you that. And I was never going to let you know unless you asked me. And I was like, whoo, so thankful I asked him to mentor me, because, to this day we're close. He calls me his 6th son. And, we met regularly for 12 years. And that was so important because I didn't have that godly man example in my life growing up. I wasn't a believer. I didn't know anything. I had to learn everything. And I think it's important that men don't keep any excuses. I think a lot of times they're keeping excuses and they don't even realize that, well, I wasn't raised Christian. I didn't have a godly father. I didn't see it modeled for me. And I'm just going to say, you know what? That doesn't matter. That could be a blessing. That could be a good thing. But it literally doesn't matter. Are you saved? And you're going to say, yes. Okay, well, guess what's in you? The Holy Spirit. And guess what you have? the holy book. You have infinite godly wisdom, and God will impart wisdom to you that aligns with the Bible. And you have brothers around you if you're going to a church. But that's why it's so important to go to churches like Josh's, where men are being encouraged to rise up. You got to go and have a council around you of brothers you can run the race with. And the only way, by the way, you're going to do that, and I had to do this. I had to learn how to do this because getting help wasn't my cup of tea. But one of the things I had to do was humble myself and realize that I can't do this alone, that I need other people to sharpen me and encourage me. And maybe the most important thing, hold me accountable. Because so many men are entrapped in sin, deliberate, consistent sin, that's causing them to have guilt on a regular basis, and they don't feel worthy of leading spiritually their families. And I'm so thankful that I've had men in my life hold me accountable so that I didn't land in that trap of guilt. And because we know, I mean, you know this, Josh, we know that Jesus forgives us. But when it comes to spiritually leading our family, I think that's a big hiccup, because that feeling of being a hypocrite and unworthy can pop in there. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, just as you were sharing your story, I think about Exodus 3 and Moses and all the excuses, right? And last week I walked a young adult who was like, I think I might have a calling to ministry, and I like going to Exodus 3 and sharing, well, here's the excuses and here's what Moses does. But the reality is, not everything that we're called to do is as blatant as Moses, the burning bush, go to Pharaoh, let my people go, right? Like, that's, God had raised him up for that task, for that job. And there's all sorts of like callings, there's maybe different perspectives on this, right? Of what you could do with your life that's going to be within God's will and all that sort of thing. But I just think one thing that every husband should know is, pouring into your wife, laying down your life, things that the Bible makes really clear, like Christ loved the church and gave himself up. For her, that's something you should have no doubt God has called you to do. And so if he's called you to do it, he's going to equip you to do it. That's essentially every excuse. Like, if someone hasn't read Exodus 3, go read Exodus 3. But every excuse that Moses has, God has an answer. I will be with you. I will give you the words. Here's a sign. And, it's the same with discipling your own kids, that God is going to equip you to do it. You just have to be willing to step into that and be obedient to what God has clearly called you to do. But it's a tension that many people feel, many men feel, when it comes to, am I good enough? Am I equipped enough? And I would just say the first step is to to summarize what you're saying is to kind of get over that and just say, if God is with you, then he will see you through it. And so just enter. And you're not going to do it you're not going to do it perfectly, no, right? And so to be able to just kind of have the humility to seek help from others, to grow yourself, to even apologize to your kids. I think a common mistake that I see God, Christian parents make is almost like using God as, this is why I want you to do what I want you to do, right? As opposed to helping your children fall in love with Jesus and obey him from a place of love and worship. You see what I mean? Like, using the Bible, you need to do this because you're a Christian kid and Christian kids do this. But sometimes it's even like, where is that in the Bible? Like, some of the things that, parents, it's like you're actually kind of imposing your behavioral will on how you want them to act. You're kind of using God like Santa Claus, kind of, Yeah. And as opposed to are we showing them that they Jesus loves you and he gave himself for you? So I don't know how you've navigated. You see what I mean, though? Like, how have you navigated that?
You're right on. I'm so glad you brought that up. I call that a religious home, and a religious home produces ungodly children often. And the reason is because it's more about using the Bible as like a weapon versus encouraging a heart for God through what's true about God and the relationship he wants with the children. And so I think that's such a valid point. That could be a whole episode just talking about that. But I think that so often, And it also can be associated with your name. Tolpins. We're Tolpins, so we behave this way. We behave that way. And while some of that's good for creating family culture and so forth, you have to be careful because it has to be motivated by a love for God. And that's your point. Your point is exactly right. And if it's not motivated by a love for God, it's just works. And it's just works that are going to die out because there's no power of God behind it.
Yeah. And to that, I would just say, like, one of the things that's been a bit of a perspective shift for me is until my kids have surrendered their hearts to God, I treat them as lost people. And that might be, I don't know how people might take that or feel about that, but we have these lists of, like, write the top 10 people that you know that need to respond to Christ. And the first 3 names on that prayer card that I pray through regularly are the names of my daughters. And because I don't want them to be good Christian kids because I'm a pastor. I want them to be saved by God's grace. I want them to be in love with Jesus. You know, I that's what I want for them. And I think, like, kind of the opposite of love is that legalism, right?
Yes.
And that's when you get these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And what can happen is we can raise up a generation who either completely rebels because they're sick of the rules, or that they there was kind of that fear, I have to do this in order to be accepted or loved, or people learn how to play the religious game like you're talking about, and they know how to honor God with their lips, but their hearts are actually still far from Him.
Yeah, we don't want to raise up little Pharisees.
Right.
We want to raise up children that love God and really want to live after God and spread His truth. So true. I always ask this question. I feel like we could talk about this stuff for a long time, and we'll talk more offline, I'm sure, in the coming time. But what's a time you rejected passivity, your own inner passivity, that made a meaningful difference on you or people around you?
Yeah, as I think about that, I think about a pivotal moment where I started dating my wife in college, and we were pretty serious and knew that it was, like, on a trajectory towards marriage. And I had never met her family. I didn't have a close relationship with them. I had never met them, and it was kind of one of those situations where, like, the passive thing to do would be, I'm just going to propose to my wife and get married, and they can bless that or take it or leave it. But, I didn't feel like I had to do that. And I actually had a conversation with my wife's youth pastor from when she was in high school, and I just kind of wrestled with him a little bit, like, man, what do I do here? I know, because it is one of those things where it's like it's like a cultural courtesy. Is that important to them? Is that not? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he told me, very wise words, he said, when you marry a person, you're not just marrying an individual, you're joining 2 families. Yeah. And he said, you have to actually wrestle with, like, not just do you love this person, but are you willing to integrate those 2 families and to sacrifice for the sake of, your in-laws, and deal with what, whatever comes of that. And I would say, so the long story short is I proposed to my wife on Christmas Eve, and it was like, I think the day before Christmas Eve, I somehow tracked down her dad's phone number, and I gave him a call, and I was like, just like shaking, this is crazy. And it was one of those things where, like, this is my first time meeting him, was like, hey, I'm Josh, can I marry your daughter? It was like, it was one of those things where it would have been totally easier to just, like, excuse it, justify it, whatever. But because of that conversation with that youth pastor, that actually has set the whole trajectory for our relationship with my in-laws and her brothers and their families. And God has been, even doing a work with her brothers and writing a story of drawing them, closer to Him and stuff. And we make it a priority to go visit, her family. We don't just visit my family, we visit her family, because there's just certain things that we do today in light of that. It might have been a small moment, like a 10-minute phone conversation. But I look at that and I look at, man, that's a responsibility that God called me to through another man, through another godly leader in my life, and that I take seriously to this day. And so, yeah, I would say it's the there's always complexities I recognize with family dynamics and all that sort of stuff, but not to give into the old kind of the stereotypes about in-laws or whatever, even joking, or like it's how you talk about and respect and honor members of your family now. And so that's something I've tried to be intentional about.
That's so good and so amazing. And of course, now that you have daughters, I'm sure that's something you would want and hope that happens to you as a father down the road. And you've modeled that. So praise the Lord on that. And it did set a great path. That's so cool. Well, hey, you got a book coming out down the road. You're writing regularly. You've got, I think a weekly email people can sign up for. Where can people find out more about what you're doing?
Yeah, people can find me on social media, Joshua D. Branham. I actually have a blog. It's joshuabranham.com. I just put out my most recent article was, it's called Training Up Timothy, 7 Steps for Apprenticeship. And so any of the stuff that we're talking about today that's intriguing for people, they want to know how to apprentice their own children, or even like in a business context, like how would I go about replicating my own leadership? Even if people don't subscribe to the blog, if you want to check out that article, I would highly recommend it, specifically to men out there. But there's a lot of info. The central hub is my website, joshuabranham.com.
That's so good. Everybody go check that out. And I so appreciate you making time for us on the Resolute Man Show. Good to have you here.
Thanks, Isaac.